Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Acclaimed Author Series, the Jewish Experiences program and a collaboration between the Jewish Community Center and the Jewish Federation of Kansas City. My name is Ethan Helfand, and I am the Director of Jewish Experiences here at the J. Before we begin, I know we've spent a lot of time on Zoom over the past couple of years, but just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We ask that all of our participants mute themselves during the presentation. If you're participating from your computer, we recommend you use speaker view. Go to the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, click on view and select speaker. You'll be in speaker view. Following Joshua's discussion with Dr. Shelley Klein, we will be taking questions via the chat. And at any point during this evening, feel free to drop your questions in and we'll have them. I want to thank our community supporters for bringing together today's event together. To the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, the Rabbinical Association of Greater Kansas City, thank you so much for your support and partnership in bringing these events together. Today's program and the entire Acclaimed Author Series would not be possible without our partners at the Jewish Book Council, who work tirelessly to bring communities like ours and link them with stories, authors, and books that expand the way we think about Jewish identity and culture. I also want to thank each of you for being here with us today. There's one last person I want to thank and introduce, and that is our moderator today, Dr. Shelley Klein, PhD. Dr. Klein is a historian and the Director of Education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education in Overland Park, housed actually in our Jewish community campus here. She received her PhD from the University of Kansas. Her research focuses on the SS of Schreinen, I hope I got that right, and the concentration camp system and the gendered perpetration of the Holocaust. Her research has been supported by grants from the University of Kansas and the University of Hamburg. She's presented at national and international conference and has been an instructor at KU's Humanities program and their Jewish Studies program. Currently, she's also teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute. On a personal note, I'm beyond excited to have Dr. Klein here with us today and have her voice and her leadership in our community. I'm constantly grateful for her vision and her community mindedness and her openness to being a true partner and collaborator with the rest of our community. Dr. Klein, thank you for being here today, and thank you for all that you do to support our community. One last thing before I hand it over. I want to share a personal thought related to our guest today, Joshua Greene. As we mark the end of the Auschwitz not long ago, not far away exhibit's tenure here in Kansas City, I think it's important to briefly look back and publicly recognize the incredible impact this exhibit has had on our community. Hundreds of thousands of people visited our Union Station to make their way through the exhibit. For many of them, their first encounter with the horrific realities of the Holocaust. I cannot commend my colleagues at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education enough for their incredible work they've done over the last year to provide critical programming, education, and resources to our community and beyond to help ensure that the messages of the exhibit are not lost on any who attend. I know that MCHE has always been an important voice in our community for educating all of us on all aspects of the Holocaust, and I'm forever grateful to them for their continued partnership and leadership on programs like bringing Joshua Greene to our community. So on behalf of so many people, I wish you a kol kavod and thank you for all of your tireless work. We're all the beneficiaries of it, and we're forever grateful for it. And so with that, I want to hand it over to Dr. Shelley Klein and to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan, for that wonderful introduction and for all of your kind words about MCHE. It's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight. And our partnership with the J is one of our, primary partnerships and one that we really cherish and has been, ongoing forever. And so I'm very, very grateful to do this program with you. And I look forward to many more like this in the future. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter tonight. Joshua M. Greene is a popular lecturer on Holocaust history and an author whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. A former instructor at Hofstra and Fordham Universities, Greene is a recipient of numerous awards for his books and films. He's also been a featured speaker at the Pentagon and the Judge Advocate General College. He was honored by the New York Public Library Distinguished Author Series. His editorials have appeared in print in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune. So again, very pleased to welcome Joshua Greene to talk about his very interesting survivor account, Unstoppable.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. So just to give a general sense of the story that brings us together, let me summarize for you a bit of the life of Ziggy Wilson. It bears mentioning, how do we avoid the obvious reality around us at this moment? As we go deeper into the kind of atrocities that we eerily are re-experiencing after 80, 85 years, it's critical that the voice of the victims be heard. Politics and the intricacies of international diplomacy are over the heads of most of us. I know it's over my head. And so is a number like 6 million. We can understand one person's story, and often one person's story does more to drive home the critical nature of events than tonnage of data from any other source. So let me give you an overview of the story of Ziggy Wilson. And from that story, we can then have a conversation that explores the issues and themes of Holocaust remembrance and perhaps even events in the world today. Ziggy Wilson was born in a small village, Krojanka, in West Prussia in 1926. When he was just 12 years old, he and his family left for Berlin because circumstances for Jews in Krojanka were growing worse and worse. The anti-Semitism was on the rise once Hitler came to power. There was still an opportunity for Jews to earn some kind of a living and have some kind of a life in Berlin because the Olympics were coming up in the next couple of years. And so the Germans still had to be on somewhat good behavior. International press were present and so on. For a while, Ziggy and his family, he was one of many brothers and sisters, did okay as cloth merchants. Then when the schools were closed to Jewish children, he was sent to a munitions factory where he was impressed into slave labor for 12 hours, 14 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. And after several years of slave labor, in January of 1943, he and other members of his family and the Jews of Berlin, many of them were deported to concentration camp Auschwitz. He survived 2 years in Auschwitz, witnessing the horrors that we have come to associate with that largest of all camps. Many people are unaware that the Nazi Party established more than 40,000 camps. Auschwitz was the largest with more than 10,000 acres. But if you can imagine a number like 40,000 camps, that's the kind of detail that later in life Ziggy wanted to make sure people understood. The extent and the depth of what occurred to the Jewish people and to other minorities. Inside the camp, he made friends with a young man named Larry Nartel, Lothar Nartelski, as his family name was. And for a while, they lived in a kind of harmony of friendship, looking out for one another. Larry got Ziggy a job working in the warehouses where the suitcases of incoming prisoners were sorted through, and with contraband that they found in those valises and suitcases, they were able to barter for food or a bar of soap or something that would help them to stay alive. On the death march from Auschwitz in January of 1945, Ziggy got to return the favor. Larry was on the brink of expiring from starvation and utter fatigue when Ziggy would not allow his friend to be shot by guards on this death march. So he bent down and had Larry climb on his back, and they struggled on together through the snow and the sleet. One night, as the guards bedded down the prisoners on this death march, Ziggy looked around and wondered how they were ever going to survive this ordeal, particularly because the shoelaces that were holding his wooden shoes together had deteriorated in the snow. This is a small story, one of hundreds, of Siggy's stories that I learned during the course of the 7 years that it took to write this biography, but it'll give you a good idea of the kind of person he was. He looked around and said, what am I going to do? If I lose my shoes, I'll die of frostbite. And if I keep my shoes on somehow, but they're not tight, then I can get a splinter. Now, if you're down to 80 some odd pounds, having come out of Auschwitz, your body doesn't have resources to fight infection. And a splinter is enough to kill you. So he saw that there was a small sapling, and he went over with the edge of a spoon that he kept from the camp. He scored strips of bark, warmed them up between his palms, braided them together, and carefully tied them around his shoes. Gingerly tried walking with them, and sure enough, they held. He said, only the Almighty could have put an idea like that in my head, how to survive by creating shoelaces from strips of bark. Ziggy was a man of God. He was a very deeply believing Jew. And I'll give you one other story, and then we'll get into our discussion together. After liberation from Camp Mauthausen by American forces in April of '45, as a way of thanking their liberators, Siggy and Larry volunteered to work for the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. That's the branch of the Army that Simon Wiesenthal was a part of, looking for evidence of war crimes and rounding up former guards in the camp and so on. A big question was, where was God? After all of the horrors that the survivors of the camps had been through, it was a challenge even to a man of deep faith like Siggy. Working for the Counterintelligence Corps, he took his first airplane ride, and he describes that it was a cold, rainy day, and the plane took off and burst through the cloud bank, and on the other side of the clouds, the sun was bright and shining, and it was a beautiful blue sky. And he said, in that moment, my faith in God was reinforced. He said it was God talking to me and saying, don't give in to the despair. Sometimes a dark cloud like Hitler might come between us, but never doubt that I'm still here. And there were things like that he told, and there were other stories that he didn't tell. Like all survivors, there were things that took place in the camps that not everyone was prepared to admit. I mean, some of the things that I've heard in my 30 years working in Holocaust testimony, I know if I was a party to some of those activities, I wouldn't want my children or grandchildren to know what I had to do just to survive. In the last months of his life, in the end of 2002, after having arrived in America with nothing and having built a business empire in oil and banking with more than $4 billion in assets, this little guy who had had no education past grade school, no resources to start with, was looking back on his life, and when the Shoah Foundation was interviewing him in those final weeks, he said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said, I have nightmares every night, and they're so terrible I don't want to talk about them. But I'm going to tell you something that may be hard for you to believe. I don't think I could live without my nightmares. He said, those nightmares of what I went through remind me of the blessings of life, what life is, especially for me as a Jew. And God forbid, he said, if I should ever have to go through it again, I would go through it again as a Jew. I didn't think I was going to write another biography of a Holocaust survivor. I'd done about a dozen, and it was enough. It's a dark, dark time of history to be studying and writing about. But reading and learning about Ziggy Wilson, I thought, this is a story that needs to be told. And that's how Unstoppable came to be. And it's what brings us here together this evening. And I'm very grateful.
Could you tell us maybe a little bit about how you came across this man? You've written all these other biographies. What drew you to him? How did you first become aware of his story? And maybe tell us a little bit about the project of researching his life.
Sure. Like many of the people with us here this evening, I'm sure I was aware peripherally of the story of how the Washington Holocaust Museum was founded. I knew there were many challenges from a curatorial and editorial perspective. What kind of a narrative should be presented in that museum? What I didn't know was that Ziggy Wilson was one of the founding members of the museum council. The phone rang one day, this is about 8 years ago now, and it was Ziggy's son, saying that he had read some of my other books and would like me to consider writing his father's story. When I read about Ziggy's participation in the museum, when I read about the kind of dynamic person he was, when I read about how much he loved his life, despite having gone through the darkness that he went through, I changed my mind and decided that this, sometimes something comes along, it's just the right time in your life, and you say, yeah, I'll do this. I have to do this. It was a moment like that. I think I was convinced more than anything else because Ziggy's son, Ivan, like his father, doesn't take no for an answer. So I didn't really have much choice.
One of the sort of compelling anecdotes you tell in the book is about when Ivan goes up to Steven Spielberg to convince him that he needs to, make an exception and come back and record his father's story. And I think that's just such an interesting moment where you see this man's, this son who's he knows the power of his father's story, and he wants to make sure that's captured.
Yeah, that is one of the many memorable moments in Ziggy's saga, the saga of Ziggy Wilzig. Spielberg had completed the interview portion of the Shoah Foundation work, and by this time, 2002, he was focusing on the cataloging of those 50,000 testimonies. But again, Ivan doesn't take no for an answer and said, look, Mr. Spielberg, my father is one of the most eloquent survivors you'll ever meet. He's friends with your friend, Elie Wiesel. Your sister is married to my father's rabbi's son. I mean, he used every possible connection he could to gently twist Steven Spielberg's arm. Spielberg said, well, sometimes we do make an exception. Give me your card and I'll get back to you. And a few weeks later, the crew showed up at Ziggy's apartment in Fort Lee.
They recorded some 10 hours of testimony from him.
It was more than 10 hours, and it turned out to be one of the longest interviews in the entire Shoah Foundation archive. And there were things that Ziggy described that he had not even told his family ever in his life. For example, the fact that when he was in Auschwitz, in order to survive, he would invent identities for himself. One of Ziggy's great skills was his tall tales. He could become in an instant anything that was needed in order to survive. So he heard that they needed bricklayers. He became a master bricklayer. 16 years old, never had any experience bricklaying, but all of a sudden he was a master bricklayer. When they needed doctor's assistants, naturally he had had years of assisting doctors back in Berlin and volunteered. He found his father there on the brink of death. His father had been terribly beaten by the guards. And as an assistant to the staff of the prisoner hospital, Ziggy was obliged by the guards to pass out potatoes from a big vat. What he didn't realize was the potatoes had been laced with poison, and what the guards were doing was a triage. All of the patients who were close to death, who weren't going to make it, they wanted to get them out quickly so that those prisoners who could recover and go back to work, doing the hard work in the camp, could come in and take those bunks. And he said, I think I helped kill my father. When they come up with these ideas of poisoned potatoes, and you can imagine living with that memory all your life. But I think He wanted his memories to be recorded and made available for a number of reasons. First of all, because he understood the power of testimony. He understood the power of first-person narrative. He had developed, in the years since coming to America, what one of the 100 of interviews I conducted, what one person described as a Shakespearean orator. He had this mesmerizing way of speaking that captivated people, and he exorcised his demons, these nightmares, by talking about them and impressing upon people the realities of what had happened in history.
I think you're, just talking a little bit more about his Auschwitz experience, the importance of the jobs that people were given really contributes to their chances of survival. And of course, as we know, survival is very much based on luck. You can do everything right, and then, you could get the poisoned potato. You could be, shot by a guard. But what struck me was his ability, as you said, to transition into the jobs that would be useful, or the luck of, his friend getting him the job in Canada, things like that, that, when we look at this experience as a whole, really reminds us that those little things, where you worked, how you worked, tremendously impacted your ability to live another day.
Yeah. I mean, you raise a critically important point that's often discussed in Holocaust studies. Namely, did victims of the camps, prisoners of the camps, have any agency in their own survival? Were they simply now bereft of options, or was there anything at all they could do? And as you rightly point out, the universe of the concentration camps defied the logic and reason of the world we know. The normal, everyday world that we live in, the rules here did not apply inside those camps. Goodness, compassion, extending a hand of friendship could get you killed. There's one story, one incident that I read or heard in a survivor testimony, that a woman and her daughter were in a camp, and a guard came in, an officer came in drunk as a skunk, and he pulled out his pistol and went down the workbench and shot every other person dead. He got to this woman's daughter, and click, his gun jammed, and he looked at it and tried to get it to work again. The woman knew that if she said anything, she could get herself as well as her daughter killed. So imagine being in that situation and not being able to say anything, not being able to do anything. That's the upside down universe of the camps. And yet, at the same time, there are examples, such as Siggy's story, where some kind of an intuition can play a role. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was a determining factor, but I would say that those prisoners who were able to follow what Siggy called his fox-like instincts, to know what to say, what not to say, where to go, where not to go, played a role in the destiny that they lived out inside the camps. But I think you rightly caution, Shelley, that we need to be extremely careful about this tendency that we see so often of vaulting survivors up as though survival itself is some kind of mark of heroism and bravery. But that's a mistake. There was a group here on Long Island some years ago who wanted me to help them with the documentary about survivors who had come to live on Long Island. I said, all right, well, show me some of your material. They sent me a flyer, and the flyer said, these people embody all that is noble in the human spirit. They remind us of the will to survive and are a symbol of hope for. All right, time out. The 6 million who didn't make it, they didn't have a will to survive? They were bereft of the human spirit? We have to be careful about the language we use and the conclusions we come to because very often that kind of an imposing of a salvationist message on the Holocaust says more about our need for closure than about the realities of history.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's a fine balance between, honoring survival without indicting those who didn't survive, because of course there's so many reasons for, when we look at the Holocaust, the normative experience is death. The majority of people who experience the Holocaust do in fact die. And so, yeah, it's an important to, while recognizing and honoring those who did live, to not disparage those who didn't. Were there any other bits of his Holocaust journey that stood out to you, little particular moments that you'd like to share with the audience tonight?
Well, there are many. There were hundreds and hundreds of Siggy stories that I was privileged to discover in the research and the interview process. This was someone who lived through the darkest of times, but those years only comprise about 25% of the book. I think that's important to mention. Part of what convinced me to write this story was that I didn't have to dwell on the darkness. I didn't have to remain in the dimension of human suffering and torment. We established that that's what Siggy went through. And then by page 75 or so, we're on the boat going to America. And the bulk of the story is what he did with his life once he came here. And for me, discovering how he took whatever you want to call that, the monstrous memories of what he'd been through, the survival experiences that he endured, and migrated those experiences into his post-Holocaust career, I found absolutely stunning. Deborah Lipstadt, in her foreword to the book, makes mention of it because it's not something that most Holocaust survivor biographies do. The bulk of the survivor literature follows a fairly predictable trajectory. This is what life was like before the Nazis were in power. This is what happened when they came to power. Here's where we were when we were forced into the ghettos. Then we were shipped to the camps. Here's what happened during our lives in the camps. Then we were sent out on death marches, liberated. We came to America or to Israel. And that's a fairly familiar narrative curve. If that's what I saw ahead, I probably would have declined doing the book. For me, this was about what we humans are capable of doing, going through the darkest of times and coming out of that. And in particular, Ziggy Wilson, who was the most joyful, outrageously funny character. Someone once described him as a cross between Shakespeare and Jackie Mason. I mean, he had this outrageous wit. I don't think I'll go into too many of the crazy jokes that he would tell, but they make the reading of his story something enjoyable rather than something painful.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about, he gets on the boat, he comes, to America with hardly anything in his pockets, and tell us a little bit about those early years and then what he's able to build here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a real rags to riches epic story. He comes at age 21 in the coldest winter on record in America, the winter of 1947. Gets off the boat, doesn't know what to do, has $240 that he saved up. That's his whole life's fortune. Ends up going to Larry Nortel's parents' apartment in the Bronx, and tells them the story. That, if you will, it's the narrative foundation of the book, is him telling the story of how he and Larry survived to Larry's parents. And Larry's father gets him his first job, which was shoveling snow across the street for a drugstore that you couldn't get to because the snow was piled up 6 feet high against the walls. Drugstore owner gives Siggy $2 a day. By day 2, Siggy's found another kid willing to do the job for $1. So at age 21, he's already showing his business acumen. He's already got a staff and he's earning profit. From shoveling snow, he graduated to cleaning sweatshops on the Lower East Side for $28.50 a week. And from there to selling neckties. With the meager commissions he earned from selling neckties, he starts buying penny stocks. He taught himself how to read the stock market reports and found, among other things, the sleepy oil and gas company in Texas called Wilshire, buys some stock in Wilshire, meanwhile gets married along the way. He and his wife get invited to a party in Newark where Siggy meets another guy, a much older businessman, who is also a shareholder in Wilshire. The older man senses in this horny kid the kind of moxie that just might make him a good candidate for a takeover of this Wilshire oil and gas company. You can imagine that moment. Ziggy Wilson, this volcano of a little guy. He was never taller than 5'5.5". He called himself a shrimp, flat-footed thing. And here he is with an opportunity to go from sweatshops and neckties to oil and gas. All right, so here's the kicker. Oil and gas was one of the most anti-Semitic industries in post-war America. So he gets family, friends, neighbors to buy stock, gets enough that he's a threat to this gas and oil company, goes to meet the directors, and when he senses that there's this anti-Semitic vibe in the air as he's talking to the board of this company, he had a device that he would do. He rolls up his sleeve, he points to the prisoner number tattooed on his arm, puts a finger in their face and says, "The last person to try to intimidate me was Hitler. He didn't succeed, and neither are you." Puts on his jacket, leaves, and takes over the whole company. Becomes the president, CEO, chairman of the board, builds it up from whatever it was, $800,000 to $80 million a year in revenues. Then goes on to do the same thing with a bank, trust company of New Jersey, buys stocks, takes over, becomes president, CEO, and chairman of the board, and builds that up to a place where it has more than $4 billion in assets. That was Ziggy Wilson.
Seems to, though, just listening to you describe him, how, and you get the sense from the book as well, just how personable and, what an endearing character this man really was. And clearly had so much, he had good luck, he had intelligence to really make the most of this post-war American moment.
He did. And perhaps to address your question of a moment ago, one of the Ziggy Wilson qualities that most impressed me was the urgent desire he felt to perpetuate Holocaust memory. He understood that, first of all, the world had no clue about what happened in the Holocaust. Look, I've taught on a graduate level, I've taught on an undergraduate level. It's shocking how little, young people in particular, but the American public in general, how little people understand about the Holocaust. There was a survey by the Claims Conference just a couple of years ago that concluded that something like 40% of the American public doesn't believe it happened. Another percentage, large number of the people surveyed don't believe that 6 million Jews were killed. I mean, the amount of ignorance is absolutely stunning. And young people the kinds of comments that I used to get in classes in college are things like, Professor Greene, what did they do in Auschwitz on weekends? Was the food kosher? Was there a gym? Someone actually asked, did they have a gym there? Could they go home on weekends? I mean, because for most people, it's something that happened a million years ago. It happened to people who speak with very strange accents. And the stories they tell are utterly unbelievable. Siggy understood that and dedicated himself body and soul to preserving and perpetuating Holocaust awareness.
I think you hit on a really important, problem. And also, there's been a continued issue with Holocaust education, both in his time, which was this initial, silence and getting people to understand what happened in those immediate years, and with the push for the museum in DC, and then eventually the growth of Holocaust education in centers like my own to push education in the schools. And those are all very positive steps. And I think we all thought, yes, we're on the right track, and we are. And yet, as we know from many surveys, there is a lack of knowledge. And I would go farther to say that isn't just in terms of lack of Holocaust knowledge, but in terms of general history and liberal arts education, that there's just a real lack at this moment. But particularly when we look at Holocaust education, it struck me from one of the things you said at the very beginning was a number like 6 million is difficult to understand. But if we read one story, that can make it somehow more relatable. And we talk about this a lot too, in terms of connecting students, particularly with empathy, that you hear one man's story, one woman's story, and suddenly it becomes not just an abstract thing that happened to people long ago with strange accents, but really a human that you have a connection with. Is this something that you've thought about in your other biographies of Holocaust survivors as well?
Well, certainly there was a time when there were more survivors to invite into a classroom to make that connection very viscerally. I mean, all you need to do is bring someone into the room who was there, and the pupils dilate. Literally they come awake. They're sitting up straighter. They're, wow, you were there. And what was abstract and theoretical becomes very visceral and very tangible and very real. Unfortunately, we're facing the dwindling away of the survivor generation. And so what do we do? Well, there is video testimony, which is an important component of keeping the memory alive. But my heart goes out to teachers, educators like you, because you're faced with an impossible dilemma. The Holocaust is a universe of human experience, and you're forced to condense it down into a week or 2 weeks of classes. Not you, but too many who attempt to teach the Holocaust fall back, unfortunately, on cliches. So that, as my friend Lawrence Langer says, the Holocaust has been reduced to a name, a number, a name, a place, and a number. The name is Mengele, the place is Auschwitz, and the number is 6 million. And that's pretty much all that people know. Very few people know, for example, that more people were killed in Ukraine and the Soviet Union than in the concentration camps. More Jews were killed outside the camps than in the camps. There's a Father Patrick Desbois who has been traveling through the eastern zone, the route taken by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing vans. And he thought he might find 100 or so mass graves on the road to the Soviet Union. It's up to something like 2,000. I mean, who knows that there are 2,000 mass graves in the former Soviet territories? And so, the question is, how do we keep people, young people in particular, focused on the details of the Holocaust, where they can understand the scope and the depth of what occurred? That's a challenge. That's a real challenge.
And I think particularly now, this is something that I think I find certainly in my work with MCHE, but I particularly find it, when I'm teaching college students, that there's a sense that, oh, they've read a book, they've seen a documentary, so students have, they've got it, they have the story. And I think what you say is exactly right, that the full story of the Holocaust is so expansive and so complicated, that it takes a while to really unpack. And it is one that is quite dark. And for people who shy away from that, they're going to really miss the crux of the story. And I'm glad you mentioned Dubois' group, then the Yehadinunum. If any of you have not gone to their website, Yehadinunum is an excellent resource for understanding more about the Einsatzgruppen and seeing they've mapped out these massacre sites, and you can click on these little dots that show the sites of where these shooting actions took place. And in many cases, you can see eyewitness testimony of people who were bystanders at the time, kids who watched these shooting actions happen. And you can see details on the numbers, where these, Jewish people came from. Were they native to that village? Did they flee from Poland? And here they are in the middle of the Soviet Union, thinking that they had escaped the Nazis. But it reminds us that there's continual research on the Holocaust going on. For too many people, we think history is sort of a set story and it's done. But like any field, it's ever evolving. And certainly this is an aspect of Holocaust studies that is growing, and we're continually getting more information on. So with that, I think we can maybe transition into some of the questions. One of them we have early on here is a question about Ziggy and encounters with Holocaust deniers. I know that was something you mentioned in the book. So if you'd like to discuss any contacts or confrontations that he had with deniers or the concept of Holocaust denial.
He was a frequent guest on the Barry Farber radio show. Barry Farber was the moderator of the most popular radio show in America back in those days. It was in the 1990s. And that was a time when Holocaust denial was on the rise in America. And Siggy was shocked when he learned that President Reagan had announced that he was going to be visiting the Bitburg Cemetery with the German Chancellor, because in Bitburg, SS officers were buried. And the idea of an American president honoring SS dead pushed Siggy over the brink. And he went to the airwaves to try to convince the president to not do this. Elie Wiesel did the same thing. He was at the White House to receive a Peace Prize. And he pivoted off of his written remarks to ask Reagan to please not do this. Please do not go to the Bitburg Cemetery. Reagan ended up going to the cemetery, and he didn't stay long, but it was, in the estimation of many historians, the low point of his presidency. At that point, Siggy stopped lecturing. He had been giving hundreds of lectures about Holocaust memory, about his experiences, and he stopped. He says, when the President of the United States does something so heinous, he said, these SS officers, they killed 59 members of my family. How can you now honor them by... Reagan's excuse was, well, can we not say that these soldiers here in the cemetery, were they not also victims of the Nazis? Weren't they taken in by the propaganda? Can we not also admit that they were victims just like the people in the camps, which was the most outrageous thing you could possibly have said? So Siggy stopped lecturing at that point. When he realized that denial was on the rise, denial, which means the Pat Buchanans and the David Dukes and the other, some of them previously respected scholars who now attempted to disprove that the Holocaust occurred anywhere near the scale that was being publicized. He realized that he could not afford to stay away, and he went back and began speaking again, and was very, very strong, and would tell rooms full of students that I want you all to be my deputies. He would deputize an entire room full of college students that you must join me now in the campaign to speak up whenever you hear this kind of lying propaganda, so that it cannot spread any further. He was quite strong about it.
That Bitburg incident is certainly one that, stands out in Holocaust history memory and is obviously continues to be very regrettable. What about future Holocaust projects? Are you truly done with the Holocaust, or do you see other works in your future?
Yeah, it's the gift that keeps on giving. My privilege has been to do 4 books for Scholastic for middle grade readers. The most recent one was optioned by Marley Maitland for development as a miniseries, because it's about a young girl who protected her deaf sister inside Camp Bergen-Belsen. So there's been quite a bit of interest in survivor stories among deaf people, particularly children, because of the success of the film Coda, which is a marvelous film. I do recommend it. So there's now been a request for another book. This one will be about a woman named Vladka Mead, who was a resistance fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto. Vladka and her husband Benjamin Mead were instrumental in building the Holocaust Museum, and Vladka was a very, very well-known Holocaust educator after she emigrated to the United States. So yeah, that's coming up. And I'm in the middle of doing a documentary film about my dear friend Lawrence Langer, who's 93 now. And Larry was the person who coined the phrase choiceless choice, meaning that prisoners in camps, there was no good choice. There was a choice between bad and worse. And so he coined that phrase. So yeah, lots to do.
So you mentioned those first 2 books are for a younger audience. Is that what you said?
12-year-olds, about middle grade readers. Yes.
Could you speak a little bit about maybe the challenge of writing a young adult book that deals with Holocaust material?
Right. I will. I'd like to preface it, though, by describing the real motive for me, which is to try and create some kind of a balance to the Diary of Anne Frank. The Diary of Anne Frank is a convenient book for introducing young teenagers or tweens, I guess they're called, because it avoids having to confront the realities of the Holocaust. There are no atrocities described in the Diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank did not know what it meant to be inside a concentration camp. If you have a book on adolescent development, it's a lovely reference. But if you want a Holocaust book, it doesn't really help. Now, it can be a doorway into deeper literature. I think particularly of the Diary of Bergen-Belsen by Hannah Levy-Haas, who also came out of the same camp where Anne Frank died of typhus, but whose diary is more the real thing. Volume 2 of Anne Frank's diary would have been an interesting book, but she didn't live long enough to write it, because having been through Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, she could have told us many things about what really was transpiring, and perhaps even comment on the naivete of the first volume of her biography. In terms of writing for middle grades, the challenge there is balancing a portrayal of the reality of what happened so that young people get a sense of what it is they're dealing with, and not burdening them with too much nightmarish material. You can cause psychic damage to a young person describing too much of the horrors that took place during the Holocaust, just as premature exposure to a sexual activity can cause lifelong damage. So there's a balancing act involved there. But it's very rewarding because it means that a new generation, a younger generation, is being stimulated, hopefully, to learn more. If I do my job well, if I tell the story well, it should leave young people wanting to know more about the subject.
I couldn't agree more about the Diary of Anne Frank. I think you're exactly right that it is a good gateway and a good story about, the realities of particular set of experiences in hiding. But certainly in terms of a full Holocaust narrative, it doesn't, as you say, tell us what happens in that part 2, part where she actually is in the camps. So when you're thinking about either writing for, a young adult audience or an adult audience, as you bring, Holocaust narratives to to the public, what is it you'd like us to take away in terms of a message about the Holocaust or a message about survival? What are some of your priorities in terms of, express what you want to leave the reader with?
The first priority for me is helping people understand that they do themselves no good and they do others no good if they use the Holocaust as an example of man's inhumanity to man. If the Holocaust becomes just a genocide among other genocides, they've done a disservice to the survivors, they've done a disservice to the victims. The Holocaust was the systematic, scientifically designed, state-sponsored mass murder of European Jewry. And we know now that had Hitler won the war, his ambitions did not stop in Europe. He wanted to destroy every Jew on the planet. So my first objective is to make sure that people understand what the Holocaust is. And my second objective is to strip away some of the illusions that people have of the Holocaust as a forum of bravery and heroism. And you don't hear survivors talking about themselves as heroes. You hear them talking about the unheroic things they had to do just to survive. And every time we cross that line, whether it's a movie like Life is Beautiful, or The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, or every time the Holocaust becomes the background to some kind of testimony to the nobility of the human spirit, we wander farther and farther away from the reality of what happened, and we leave ourselves naive and unprepared for acknowledging what will happen next. I think we're at a moment now historically where knowledge of what happened in Europe in the 1930s is critically important for an accurate evaluation of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. I don't want to detour too much into politics, but I do believe that there are enough similarities that can be drawn here that Holocaust education can play a critical role in a realistic evaluation of what's going on today.
Okay. Well, Joshua and Shelley, thank you so very much for really fascinating and interesting and in-depth conversation about the life of Siggy. And I can say, having read the book myself, and I know Shelley read the book, absolutely recommend you picking up a copy of this book. It is fantastic. And unlike any other Holocaust memoir that I have had a chance to read, and want to thank both of you, Joshua and Shelley, for joining us tonight and for leading us in this conversation. So grateful to have you and your voices in our community. And thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again at a future Acclaimed Author Series event. And with that, we'll wrap up and say goodnight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley.